Good evening, everybody. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, and I am here as often am with my good friend Brendan Bond. Good evening, Brendan.
Good evening, Nick. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing real good, and I am excited to have a conversation tonight about something that I was reminded of that happened, and it got me thinking kind of a series of events that we don't really get so much anymore. It was a time and place. But before we get there, I got a text from you over the weekend, and I wanted to talk about it. So something strange happened to you, but it wasn't anything strange you thought was especially weird. It was just odd. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything you were ascribing anything particularly phenomenal to. But we started talking about it, and I said, hey, you should just stop, and we should just record it. So let's talk about that. Tell everybody the story of yours.
It's nice to have this outlet, because usually people just say, just stop, but then I'll follow up with, let's save it for the episode. So I appreciate that.
Right.
Like, dude, okay, it's enough. No, but so what happened was over the weekend, I was hiking with one of my friends at a local park here in Butler County. And one that I've been to a few times, but haven't been there for a few months. And really, it's just a really nice spot. And it gets a decent amount of foot traffic, I think. Like it's pretty popular. It's kind of a little bit of a hidden gem in the area.
It's right outside the city I live in, and this is, again, Butler County, Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Which Spawn speaks.
Yes. And so really nice place. So going there for a hike and everything. Saturday was really nice out. What I normally do, which is, birding, taking pictures, just taking things in. As I'm walking behind one of these old outbuildings, I look down and I see what looks like a Bigfoot print. And when I looked at it, I thought, this is very obviously someone who took like a pocket knife and cut a silhouette of a Bigfoot print out of like the sod. Like the print went down. Like that's exactly what it looked like. It looked like someone cut it out.
Yeah, kind of a weird thing to do.
Right, yeah, weird thing to do. And like that's all I thought about it. I was like, oh, that's really weird. I took a picture of it because we do, what we do.
I was going to say we talk about weird things, right. So there we go.
Yeah, but again, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, that's a weird thing for a person to do. I took like one photo and just kind of went about my day. Didn't think a whole lot else of it. Sent a picture to you and a few other people, just be like, hey, look at this funny thing I found.
And I felt bad, and the reason why you brought it up before we started is because I didn't respond. I was doing a bunch. I work on Saturdays as well, and right. By the time I was able to get around to it, I had totally forgotten about it. So, because you didn't send like a bunch of stuff you weren't flipping out. You were just like, why would somebody do this?
Yeah, exactly. That was the extent of my questioning. So I did end up sharing it with one of the larger groups that I'm associated with, just thinking like, hey, you guys would appreciate this. I thought it was a weird thing to find on a Saturday afternoon in a park, kind of thing. And relatively quickly, a few people reached out with basically saying that this is in fact a known thing. It's not common with the paranormal, but it does happen. And
now, a known thing, like how? Because like crop circles are a known thing, which is very clearly a man-made thing. And I say very clearly because the group that started it kind of outed themselves at one point, and they must have been amazed because there are still people that insist, like, no, they may have done some of them, but look at the strange magnetic issues that come from the. So yeah, how is it a thing exactly?
So what these folks were saying, again, this is all like anecdotal stuff. This isn't like published stuff, I don't think, anywhere, but basically saying that what is a known phenomenon is this idea of the other, or anything that has a trickster element to it, anything that is trying to look normal but in fact is paranormal, often gets things wrong. You hear that with everything from the Black-Eyed Kids. You hear that with like certain like demonic stories.
I'm reminded of Stephen King's From a Buick 8, which I really like, which takes place right here, coincidentally.
Right, exactly.
Where Buick pulls up and it's missing one porthole on one side, and like a lot of little things like that.
Right, like there's a story I can think of that had a gentleman that saw this like 3-headlighted modern car, and everything looked normal about it except that it had 3 like evenly spaced headlights, and just like it's kind of stuff like that. That there are times where this whatever this other stuff is tries to do something to get someone's attention or do whatever and kind of gets it wrong, because this is an example of a footprint that isn't like, it's not a footprint. It looks like a footprint, but it is not a footprint because it literally looked like it was cut out of the sod. Like, it wasn't an impression. The topsoil beneath the grass was not disturbed, so it wasn't like anything was digging or anything. So I don't really know if it was in fact paranormal or not, but I thought it was interesting that these folks brought this up and actually cited a few sources. There's apparently a cemetery over in the eastern side of the state where a few of these were also found a few years ago. So there is like some precedent for it, which I had no prior knowledge of. Because if I would have thought about it at the time, I would have documented it better and would have, gone about it differently. And I certainly would have been more excited at the time.
Well, I'll tell you what I think. I think someone was trying to just make it look like there was a footprint. It seems like a goofy thing to do. It seems especially goofy that somebody's cutting out, multiple people in multiple areas are cutting out fake footprints.
Right.
I mean, if the only other example of it's also in the Commonwealth of PA, could it be like the same person or people that communicate with one another?
Right.
I don't think there's anything paranormal about it.
I don't. Yeah, I mean that's my gut reaction as well too. I'm going to do a little more research into it and see if I can find anything else out there, or maybe if I can just even find other examples of like the other getting things wrong. That might be an interesting set of stories to cover.
That is interesting to me, that idea, because it is something that's unsettling.
Right.
I'll tell you. I think I've told you this story before, and this is kind of this in a very, very silly way. I was on the road for work, and I was up in the northern tier of Pennsylvania, out by Emporium.
I love it up there.
Had to use the restroom very bad. I drank like a gallon of tea, and
been there.
I run into a well-known gas station in the region, and I run into the restroom, and there is a urinal. Typically, those are associated with men's rooms.
Yeah.
And I'm very relieved as I'm relieving myself, and I look over, and there was I swear, because I've never seen one, there was a tampon dispenser there.
Okay.
And I thought, oh no, have I gone in the wrong room? Because like that's normally not something you see in the men's room in a gas station in rural Pennsylvania.
Right.
And there was this moment of fear. That is a very, very stupid example of like this thing is kind of a little out of place, maybe, perhaps.
Right.
But there you are.
Right. So we'll see if anything more comes of that. But I thought that was an interesting example of like, even when you're someone like us who is constantly reading and researching things and looking stuff up, there's always more out there that we haven't come across yet.
Yeah, and if you're some maniac who's tearing up the sod in local parks, I'll have you know.
Yeah, like, don't do that. Like, just stop. That's not.
There's
that's
ordinances
not cool.
against such
things.
Right,
it's not cool, dude. Like,
well, it is very cool. Yeah. Look, they got you taking photos.
They got me. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if that was the person's, if it was a person and that was their motive, then mission accomplished, I guess. Here we are.
Now, on the subject of hoaxes, though,
yes,
I want to talk about something. Now, as you know, I'll have YouTube on. I'll be listening to like news things, and random videos will come up that are around my interest. I've just gotten over a big shipwreck on Great Lakes kick. There's some wonderful channels out there that cover shipwrecks and different nautical things, specifically on the United States and Canada's Great Lakes. And
outside of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is like the LeBron James of Great Lakes shipwrecks.
There's so many great and terrible stories. Like there's I forget, it was called like the Christmas tree ship or something. It did an annual deliver Christmas trees, but there's
it's a whole thing. Yeah.
So many interesting ones. I think if we didn't talk about one particularly unique one, I think I had it on the agenda and we hadn't got to it yet. But either way, I was watching and listening to YouTube in the background as I'm doing my reports and whatnot. And a video came on that reminded me of something I had seen bits of when I was young. And I want to talk about it for a few reasons. One, I know you're familiar with the writer Chuck Klosterman.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, wrote for ESPN, wrote for Spin. He's written a few books that you and I both
I got
really
a few
enjoyed.
back here right now. Yep.
Did you read his book on the 90s?
Which one was that? Eating the Dinosaur? Or was that after?
No, it was on the 90s, or maybe it was just called the 90s.
No, I haven't. No, I think the last one I read was his novel, Downtown Al, I think.
I enjoyed Downtown Al. We'll get into that some other, not here.
Yeah.
But he wrote a book on the 90s, and the only reason I bring it up is I forget exactly how he describes it, but he essentially puts it's like the last decade of its kind.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because, and there's some sense to that. I know I've spoken about, I have a lot of older friends. I have friends that grew up that were born in the 40s and grew up in the 50s and 60s. And the childhood that we experienced,
right?
They experienced in the 50s, the 60s, other friends in the 70s, wasn't really that dissimilar from the childhood that we had in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And that's because, think about it, I mean, cars were a thing. Right. Television was a thing. I mean, we grew up in the era of VCRs, and it really is only to the very tail end of our adolescence that like TiVo came around. And so most of our youth was spent outdoor stuff. Video games were a thing, but they weren't as engaging for most people as they are now because they've just gotten so much better in many ways. So it's interesting to me that there really are a few, I hate the term because I think it's just a way to sell people garbage and to divide people, but there really are a few generations of people that grow up with a very similar, and the 90s are kind of the last of that. It's postulated by Klosterman in large part because there's a big shift in how we feel with 9/11. Right. There is the telecommunications and all the media associated with that.
Home internet, yeah.
Right. And there's really the atomization of interests and media further. And so, this little thing that we do is part of that. So it really is a distinct change. And so cat's out with that. Now, there were a few programs and a couple movies I want to bring up. Of course, you remember maybe 1999, then the Blair Witch, right? You remember the Blair Witch?
First of the big found footage movies.
Yes. And arguably not the first, but certainly the biggest of them.
Right, for sure. Yeah, certainly not the first, but the greatest impact in not only the horror genre, but it was the first one where you had a lot of people who were really confused because of their level of media literacy of not just those people, but just culturally, the media literacy hadn't gotten high enough yet or current enough to where you had people who legitimately thought that because it was found footage, therefore it was in fact real.
Well, and I remember the build up to it. Now, we're not going to focus on the Blair Witch. There's tons out there about that. But this is just an example of one of these. I remember the build up to that. There were programs presenting it as a real thing.
Right.
There was also, I'm sure you remember, this was on Fox, Alien Autopsy.
Yes.
Do you remember that? Now, a lot more people remember the 1995 Alien Autopsy, and I think that's because X-Files was very big.
Huge, yeah. X-Files
and there were tie-ins. And in fact, in the X-Files, at one point, Mulder says something, this isn't like the one they showed on TV, because that one showed too much. This looks like a real operation. They were dissecting an alien on a train car, and if my memory
that's a creepy scene when you see all them running around. That still gets to me in the tunnels.
It was an icon. Anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm listening to YouTube, and it brings up this made-for-TV thing. It aired on Halloween. 1994, and so a little before the Alien Autopsy, but another one of these, it wasn't necessarily presented as real, but
Right.
there wasn't much anything around it that said it wasn't real. It was called Without Warning. And I think this is one of those artifacts of media that a lot of people are starting to be made aware of it again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say that I caught a little bit of it in real time. It was made in part as like an homage to the Orson Welles
Right.
War of the Worlds, which
Mm-hmm.
again is one of the most overhyped things ever. It was
Right.
not.
Right.
It was not as you are told it was, with people panicking and whatnot.
Right. Right. Right.
So I'll give just a very quick thing, but I'm going to hand it over to you because did you ever heard of it?
I had never heard of it until you mentioned it. So that's why I
Okay.
was so excited once I started looking at it, because I literally texted you back and I'm like, what the hell is this? You know, and like it was, so it was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was presented, it was on CBS and it was being presented like there was a made for TV movie on, but then it was interrupted. Now, did you
Mhm.
ask anybody that you know if they had any memory of it?
I asked a few people, and I think just because of where I'm at, when folks were growing up, I don't think anyone who I asked had cable at the time.
Yeah.
I
Well,
wouldn't have had it in
remember, this
'94.
this was on broadcast
Right.
television, so
Oh,
because
that's true. That's true.
yeah,
But the three people I did mention weren't familiar with it either. So this I think will
okay.
hopefully be new to a lot of people.
And
So
it's available for you to view the entirety of, but I'm gonna pass things over to you to kind of give people a rundown of what it's about and just a quick rundown, and then I kind of am curious to talk to you about it, and I have a theory as one. I have a few ideas as to
right.
why maybe we don't see too much of this anymore. However, there kind of has been a little bit of resurgence. I'll talk about that, but go on.
Right, right. Yeah, and we'll get to the idea of like viral marketing that we have these days and things like that. But basically what this movie is, like you mentioned, Nick, it's shot almost like what we would call nowadays a mockumentary style. It is made to look like something else, in the sense that it starts off with it interrupting. There's like some movie playing where someone is getting murdered in their house, and it cuts to news coverage.
Yeah, they
Um,
cut the hot scene too.
right. Yeah, I know. Right. Which, yeah, again, for '94, it's a little spicy.
Pretty risque.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see a man's back. So when it comes to what they did is it was really interesting, and it's nice because what I think it does the whole time is it does really treat the viewer as someone who is uninitiated into what's going on, both from a plot standpoint, but it doesn't like beat home the idea that hey, you're watching a fake thing. It's really they really do try and make it seem like a real news broadcast. And I think part of that is because they actually had probably some serious input from broadcasters. Now, there were a lot of actors in there, but there were definitely some people who were not actors, like you could tell by the performances.
Right,
Um,
like the main guy on the news bench,
mhm.
and a couple of the other news
Yeah,
reporters were
mhm.
actual reporters and were
Right.
known entities.
Mhm.
And it's not just one breaking news interruption; it's a series of breaking news interruptions that then becomes like, "Hey, we're going to
Right.
cover this in real time
Right.
because this is
Right.
earth, shattering
Right.
news."
Right. And that's something I definitely want to talk a little bit more about later, because it is a little it is a little rough to watch sometimes, because you're like, this is what a crisis actually looks like on network television.
I
Um
I definitely agree with you, and I want to touch upon that later.
yeah,
But give
right,
us give us
right.
that
But
rundown.
the rundown, basically what happens is you have three simultaneous asteroids that hit the Earth. One in, I believe, Wyoming, one in outside of Lourdes, France, and one outside of Mongolia in China. And there's some weird stuff that happens with it, which they cover and everything. At two of the locations, the one in France and the one in Wyoming, they're just looking at seismic activity. Then they start to find a survivor or two, and kind of like the weirdness starts to ensue. People start realizing something strange is happening here. And as you're kind of following along with the broadcasters, which is a really interesting plot device, because the broadcasters who are basically narrating the story don't know any more than you know. They're finding out things with you, which is an interesting storytelling device. You see all this like you see these hints of behind the scenes actions. Like they have reports coming in of just these kind of weird things that almost seem unrelated. You have the entire occupants of a town that disappear. The survivors they do find are speaking in an unknown language. Lead NASA researcher from SETI is flown from one location to another kind of thing. And they really do a good job of painting like the confusion and the multiple things that are moving all across the world because it's supposed to be a major channel broadcast, and they have correspondents in a lot of these places. So you have these different countries that are reacting. And as like scientists are starting to study this and everything, they start realizing all this kind of just weird stuff is happening. And as they're getting into that, you're seeing all this footage of the different locations and just what's going on, and it really is kind of unsettling. And as they start, everyone is very aware of now, whenever there's a crisis happening, they cut to experts to like fill the gaps while they're waiting for news conferences to happen and things along those lines. And you have these different experts that come in. You have some people that are astronomers. You have people who are writing on UFOs and stuff like that.
You have Arthur C. Clarke appearing as himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of a weird fourth wall kind of thing with that. And you have footage of Bill Clinton and like over in a UN summit kind of thing. So it really does feel like a real broadcast in that sense. But so as things get weirder and weirder, you get someone who puts together that these all landed at like the 45th latitude or longitude or something like that. Yeah, longitude. And they all would have had to be one asteroid coming from exactly the top of the Earth that then broke apart, and the math that is shown through the trajectories and everything mimics what was on the Pioneer spacecraft. I'm not sure if it was one or two that was sent out that had all the math and science from Earth that was sent out into the cosmos years and years ago. So they start planting the seed of like, maybe this is extraterrestrial in some way, shape, or form. And that's when you first see this kind of division that you see in lots of alien movies, where you have some people that are staunchly opposed to it, some people who are the true believers, and you're seeing how that affects both the broadcasts and the reactions of the governments and people. Then another asteroid are coming towards the planet, and some people are saying, oh, this is just part of the same cluster of comets, so it's not extraterrestrial. They figure out a way to get rid of the asteroids, and they end up shooting it down. Then they shot three more that were coming or something. After this gets shot down and everything, there's this humming that occurs all across the planet around this parallel. You see planes getting grounded, and you see everyone kind of getting to the point where like, oh, this is like a real bad situation, because if one of these asteroids hits, they mention, the KT boundary and everything, and talk about like how bad it's going to be if one of these asteroids actually hits. And meanwhile, they're like putting in like actual commercial breaks and stuff like that, which I thought was cool. So after the second thing of asteroids is taken care of, more panic is ensuing and everything, and they realize there's three more coming, and they are aiming for very specific locations. It's like Washington, D.C., Moscow, and I think Beijing.
It was. And at one point, one of the astronomers that said he won, he even says his suspicion is because these are nations, capitals of nations, that have a first strike policy.
Yes. So in like things escalated after we used the first like nuclear tip missile or something like that, was what they were thinking was going to happen. So you have people going back and forth on whether or not this is extraterrestrial or not, but you have like the governments saying, well, either way, we need to like take care of these things, regardless of why. Spoiler alert, if you don't want to hear what happens, skip ahead a minute or so. So what ends up happening is there's these
or don't. It's been out since 1994.
Right, that's true.
If
That's true. But if you want to watch it yourself, stop listening right now. Go watch it and come back and pick up.
If you're the sort of person who's going to be interested in this, you're going to watch it no matter what, because you already know the world doesn't end because we're here right now, and it's some years after.
It's true. So what ends up then happening is they realize, okay, well, if these three nations fire nukes at the three asteroids that are coming, that's our last chance, because if any one of them hit, the world's going to end. And you have all of like the people coming to the realizations at this time that like this is probably going to happen, like the world's probably going to end. So you have just a lot of like the stuff that you see in like The Day After Tomorrow and other films that have those like apocalypse scenarios. And it's really great because there's some really serious, like kind of like heart-wrenching scenes where you have these journalists realizing in like you know, what's supposed to be live time, that like they're never seeing their families again, you know, but they're still trying to like report and like do their job kind of thing. And it just escalates. They end up shooting down all three of the asteroids. Everyone is celebrating. And then suddenly they realize that there are thousands of asteroids coming at the planet, and everyone realizes that's going to be the end of it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this is, again, the way it's presented as they're interrupting another movie.
Yeah.
That there's that aspect, and then it's combined with the fact that there's really only two things that at any point hint to this is a creative product and not an actual breaking thing. And it's one that I find is there's way too much happening way too quickly, and we'll get into that a little bit, but their ability to scramble everything as quickly as they did, but also get reporters down on the scene and get, at one point, one of the broadcasters says with like 2 minutes left on the countdown, hey, you can leave and see your family. You're not getting to see your family when there's only 2 minutes. So it's a lot of things like that, that I think a person that was being coldly rational, it wasn't terrified and caught up in this, would say, well, this seems a little suspicious. And then at the very, very end, it kind of pans away from the screen of watching digitized meteors come down to actual like meteor showers and panning over different radio communications. So those are like the only two things that that and some of the acting's not great, but most of it's pretty good.
Fun fact, one of the actors, the first person that I recognized, because I was like, I wonder if I recognize any of the actual actors in this. One of the reporters is John DeLance, who is Q from the Star Trek series.
I'm embarrassed to say that I do know who that is.
Yeah, that's if you're a Next Generations fan, you know Q. So when I saw him start talking, I was like, it's Q. Cool. Like, it's definitely aliens now, you know? Like,
do you remember there was that green space character on the Flintstones that only Fred Flintstone could see?
Do.
Thank you. That's kind of like Q.
It really is.
But it's Star Trek.
Yeah, it was like this Greek chorus almost. Yeah, but he's a heck of an actor. That guy. Yeah, but that guy's a heck of an actor. But yeah, like there was a lot of things that like they really did try and make it feel like a real news broadcast. And I think they were successful in that for the most part. Like again, the very convenient timing of everything, like, you know, obviously, you know, but yeah. I think they did what they set out to do.
Now, I will say that much like I led by saying this was an homage to the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast, the Orson Welles, that everybody thinks caused the panic. Now, that again, there doesn't seem to be any historic demonstrable evidence that it caused any sort of panic. It was said it was a stunt. It was a publicity stunt to say that it caused all sorts of panic. I have no memory of this broadcast causing any sort of panic either. But I will say, now that we're 30 years out watching it, it definitely hits very differently. Did you find it entertaining?
I think it was entertaining for sure.
Yeah, I did too. But it definitely wouldn't hit with the same amount of fear.
Right.
You know.
Right. It's interesting because like for me, like not to get like too personal or anything, but but the things that hit for me were things that like definitely like get me about these types of movies, because I will forever be scarred by the newsreel scene from Signs. Do you remember that where the
I
alien
never
walks?
saw it.
Dude, Signs is really good. It's worth watching.
It wasn't because
Yeah, it
here's my
was.
thing. All I know about Signs is that aliens that are
Water.
can be killed
Yeah,
by
right.
water.
Yeah,
And
it's
did they not do any like recognizance before like getting down on the
there's
three-quarter
some
water planet?
there is some disbelief that needs to be implied by the viewer. But that being said, there's a scene where they're showing footage for like a birthday party, and Walking Phoenix is in the uh like in his little closet watching this on a little television, and you see an alien walk across like an alleyway, and his reaction in the movie is the same reaction I know I had and a lot of people have, which is basically just like jump out of your seat because it's so just like shocking. And even though you don't see any aliens in this one, it feels like a lot of those kind of movies because it's almost found footage style before found footage style was really popular. It a lot of it feels like the movie Day After Tomorrow or any other like apocalypse movie, even like Armageddon, anything like that. That being said, I think that like part of it kind of reminded me of some of the old Godzilla movies with showing like how different people react to a world-ending event.
I
Um,
didn't consider that, but yeah.
yeah, like oh, I thought for a second it was going to basically be the King Ghidorah movie where an asteroid hits and it turns out it's not an asteroid, it's King Ghidorah. But
More of a
um,
Gamera man myself.
that's understandable. That's but it did remind me of a lot of those kind of movies, and it also when they talked about SETI and they talked about the different people that like Contact with Jodie Foster, there's a lot of this idea that like science is there's conventional science and then there's the science that believes in the possibility of extraterrestrial existence in one shape or form, and how it shows that they're very diametrically opposed. And these movies are interesting because you're seeing what those things look like when they're all trying to operate within the same logistical and kind of like power structures that we have as a society. That is just, it really harkens back to a lot of other movies that I really like, and are really impacting, I think.
Now, one of the things I couldn't help but think about now, okay, coming back to Klosterman's about like the 90s being the last
Mm-hmm.
decade of that type, there does seem to be a dramatic drop off in these. And I think the high water mark, or at least when the wave crested,
Mm-hmm.
was with the Blair Witch Project, which came out in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, there was very recently, in the past year, there was an alien autopsy in Mexico that I think you may
Oh,
have heard about.
oh, the little paper mache aliens. Yeah,
Yes.
okay, yeah,
Right.
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, that again, but it's being presented in very much the same way. I don't think as many people were taken in by it. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's in part because I don't think people are much more media savvy, because look at the
Right.
internet and how like we are all able to go to some what are presumably reliable sources in order to
Right.
fact check things, and yet so many of
Still,
us
we
do
don't.
not bother
Yeah.
to do that.
Right. Right.
But there definitely is a shift in how media is used, or what is
Mhm.
the popular form, what are things that people recognize
Right.
in media. So I think a lot of that is just change in trends.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing, of course, that I couldn't not think about watching this, like you said, when you're seeing all these news broadcasts, it really was like a crisis in real time, except
Right.
for, as I said, there was like way too much
Mm-hmm.
too soon, because this was
Right.
only a 2-hour broadcast.
Right. Right.
The thing that I couldn't not think about during all of this was, of course, September 11th
Mm-hmm.
and everything
Mhm.
that happened then. And so I think the appeal, after like a really real trauma for a
Right.
lot of the world, Americans and Canadians in particular,
Mhm.
let's just, for a real trauma like that, for people in these countries, I think it took the shine off the appeal
Right.
of the fake, hoaxing that we could enjoy. Very, very few, if anybody, was actually in a panic over.
Right. There was a movie that was recommended to me recently. I think it was called It Comes at Night or They Come at Night. Um, and it's supposed to be really good. I couldn't get 5 minutes into it because it was a movie about like a post-apocalyptic situation about, as a result of a pandemic. And that's something that like I just have no interest in. Like I just can't deal with that anymore.
Now
I'm
that's interesting.
yeah,
I kind of wonder now if we'll see
we will.
a drop off in
Right.
such things because people are so burned of the subject.
Right.
But
Right.
again, the hoax sort of thing. Now, I'm sure people out there can let me know if there's any high profile ones that I'm missing. But yeah, after the Blair Witch,
Well,
I guess there's like the
yeah.
paranormal activity movies and
There's paranormal
whatnot. But
activities, which
even
are
those, that's a shift away from something like the Blair Witch had the paranormal aspect,
right.
but
And you have
the hoaxing
right.
like the alien
Right.
autopsy,
Like
like yeah.
there was a movie called I think it was called The Fifth Kind or Fourth Kind. Yeah, Fourth Kind. It was about a series of alien abductions in Nome, Alaska that was billed that was like supposed to be a documentary kind of thing. Very similar to this, very similar to other mockumentaries. Um, Even to the point where it had like fake interviews like we see in like other documentaries, and it even had like people talking about the documentary in the film to kind of like sell it kind of thing. It kind of reminds me of like Fargo, where you can tell any story and just start with based on a true story. like
Right.
like
Yeah.
like as a director or writer, you could just do that. Like so
Right. There's enough stories out there that are similar enough.
yeah, right. So I think there are examples like that, and I think they just take different forms nowadays. But specifically with like news broadcasting, like faking I think a lot of that has to do with things like Columbine and other really awful news events, because there's countless ones, unfortunately, that became so prevalent with with especially with the whole idea of a 24-hour news cycle, which wasn't around in previous generations. Um,
Yeah, it was 1980 that Ted
right.
Turner, or 80 or 84, I forget.
Something along those lines, early
It was
80s.
yeah, but there's also the fact that we, to sit down and watch the news, like this wouldn't be as effective today
Hmm.
because television programming isn't what it was, even on the broadcast networks, which is kind of there's very few people getting them broadcast anymore.
Right. Right.
But even on the broadcast network, programming isn't what it used to be, and not nearly that many people. Like their joke is like if you're watching CNN, you're likely in an airport.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Right. Right. And it's interesting. I think those things are going to keep kind of changing with the times and everything. But I think a lot of the elements that you see in these movies, um, of how we cover things, how we interact with media, and what that informs us about the world that we're living in, is going to keep morphing and taking different lenses. But a lot of the meat of those things is going to stay the same. I think where you have because a lot of these stories, beyond being like world-ending events, a lot of times are stories about people running into something that challenges their worldview in one way, shape, or form. And you always have a back and forth between people who are the initiated that are like, oh, this is aliens in this case. And then you have people who are like, well, this probably isn't aliens, and then you have people who are like, this can't be aliens. And a lot of these movies or shows or whatever are about how those three things interact with each other and what it takes for people to move from one side to the other. In a lot of these movies, it's about people coming to the realization that there is more in the world than what they are generally shown to or want to believe.
I'll say one thing to that, and then I want to pull something up. The one thing is, it always seems to me in these types of conflicts in film, they present, in this case, members of the military are being presented as those who don't believe that there's any evidence, but it's kind of framed as though they know better, but they're saying that there's no evidence. That seems to be the way.
Yeah, and I think that's partly due to this ever-present conundrum that I think a lot of folks who are really into UFO history and the disclosure movements and things like that. There's this paradox of the government being so good at covering things up, but also inept at the same time, and not wanting to address that, like, those things probably can't exist in the same space. Probably somewhere in the middle is what the reality probably is. But I think you're right that that's usually how it's shown, because in this film, the folks who are part of, like, the military in this case, are seen as the antagonists almost to, quote unquote, like, the truth. That's a trope we see all the time. But I also don't think that that's necessarily always the case in real life.
Oh, no.
Obviously.
Here's the other thing I wanted to bring up, though, pivot to. And you mentioned in your rundown that there's this entire town where all the residents and cats and dogs, even, they say, disappear. I don't know how they had a tally on the cats and dogs, especially with everybody in town being gone, but they've all disappeared. Now, very little is actually said about that. They show like maybe a minute of a reporter on the scene with the military or the National Guard who's coming in to check things. But a part of me said, boy, you'd think they'd mention more about that. Isn't that weird? Then another part about is like, well, no, this is such a huge thing. Like, this would be a footnote. But then there's the question that is begged. What happened to these people? Were they raptured almost?
Right.
So is that dependent on just a small town, or if these are aliens, are they going, you know what? We need to keep some of these specimens. How about we pick a random small city in the American Midwest? They seem like a good representation of the general global population. Are there other towns across the globe that they just didn't have time to put into 2-hour broadcasts?
Right. So I think there's two things going on there. One,
intergalactic zoo. That's where you're going, right?
So one, from a writing standpoint, that is a great device to use, because you can't go into the backstory of all these things. So as a writer, you can say, hey, I need 6 really cool, weird things to happen that we're going to touch upon and then never address, to create the illusion of more bigger things going on. So as far as...
Oh my goodness. What if it was the rapture, but it's overshadowed by all these other things happening? What
if aliens and the rapture just happen to happen on the same evening?
But have nothing to do with
each other, completely independent.
Totally different. What if the Maple Leafs win the cup, as Toronto has struggled?
They have.
For years.
Those poor guys.
And the cup rate is off.
It is. No, the cup rate is off, and it doesn't do the club justice for how much work they put in over the years.
If the Leafs go to the playoffs, I might start to worry that aliens are next.
Something's coming. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So that's my first thing. Then I think the second, I just lost
about the Rapture Town. You said that hey, as writers need 6 events, and we're not going to be able to touch upon them.
Yeah. So the second thing there is that you see throughout the film how you have certain people, like the one astronomer, talking about how like they came in peace and we are the ones who screwed it up. Like they're very clear at the end.
You don't know what happened. They're not even telling you, and he kind of discloses we had a direct communication,
something along those lines, and they had stuff that came back from the Voyager thing, and they were just trying to make contact. But whenever, and it kind of implies something that a lot of people say, is that like these, like if we interacted with an alien race, odds are the how we communicate and things like that could be so astronomically, no pun intended, different, that like a hey, what's up from one race or one species might not be interpreted the same way. And I think that like that's something that it's an important thing to talk about when people are trying to define what extraterrestrial contact could look like.
There's a statement out there. I don't know if it's an adage or a proverb or something like that, but it runs to the effect of, if a lion could suddenly just speak perfect, insert any human language here, English, we still wouldn't be able to understand it
Well,
because it's just its world is based not only around visuals but so much more around smells and
right.
everything. I think there's something to be said, and you're kind of getting on that. But I also am reminded of being in a planetarium at our junior high school while we were on an elementary field trip to the planetarium that was in the building that was our junior high school. And I thought the guy that did it was a pretty smart guy, not just because he was running the planetarium machine, but he was asked by one of the kids if he thought, there was aliens and everything. And this is just a few years before this and the alien autopsy comes out. And he said something I thought it stuck with me 30 plus years later. He said, "Oh, I definitely think there's life out there. I don't know if anybody's going to come and visit us. I mean, because they'd be able to pick up our broadcast most likely and look at us." He's like, "Look at how violent we are." Now, there's no reason to suspect that any higher form of life that would be able to do intergalactic travel wouldn't also be violent. But a lot of times, we believe that they would have to be. One of the reasons it's been said that we're afraid of aliens is because we assume exactly they would treat us like we would treat any other. But he said, I don't think they'd come to visit us because I think they would see how we behave and they'd say, "Hey, we better keep our distance. Let's just watch them." I thought that was smart.
Right. No, I think that's a smart response, especially to like a younger kid. And I think that that's something that people bring up a lot. The idea that like, oh, like what if they're like us? I've always been of the mindset that if like let's take that kind of paradigm. I would think that anyone who's able to have interstellar travel of any kind is probably living in a post scarcity society.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you're able to go from planet to planet, like the idea of something that consumes us, which is the idea of gathering wealth and resources, wouldn't be something that they would have had in their culture.
But what about the intergalactic locust? I mean, there has been more than one. You know what? I'm coining that phrase.
Right.
That is a Nick Pennsylvania original. There's been numerous of these sort of things where they're not here to colonize, they're either coming here to leave some sort of animal that is their cow.
Well, Bigfoot,
Yeah, right. There you go. And they are intergalactic locusts. Their planet dried up. They move on. They consume. That would be very human.
Right. That'd be very human. But that's also closer to like the idea of Borg or like a hive mind or bees, that you have things that are like basically a super organism, which again, maybe if there is something out there, that's what it is. One of the things that they did touch on in this movie that I don't know if we've actually specifically talked about yet is the idea of like the Fermi paradox. Are you familiar with this off the top of your head?
It sounds like something that we've talked about, but I'm not retaining any information.
Fermi,
I'm more perturbed by the second Star Trek reference of the evening that I picked up on.
Hey, I'm a big Next Gen fan, but but the idea of the Fermi paradox, not the Ferengi paradox, to make a Voyager reference. Sorry. The Fermi paradox is basically this idea that there is a discrepancy between if there was like abundant sentient life in the universe with how big the universe is, we would have heard from them by now. And that's kind of what a lot of scientists kind of go to. Like if it's not rare, if it's not super, super, super rare, then it would be abundant. And since it doesn't appear to be abundant, it must be super, super rare. So the idea of technologically advanced, again, we're assuming other places would have technology to advance like we do. Because like we almost can't even wrap our heads around what those things kind of could be. Maybe that is so rare that there are trillions of light years and time between those societies popping up like little bubbles in a pool. Each bubble doesn't know the other one's there, doesn't ever get to talk, kind of thing.
And the bubbles pop.
They pop, exactly. And that's just like the natural state of things. Now, again, that is very much rooted in, I think, the idea that it's kind of like Star Trek, where like these other societies are just like a few thousand years either advanced or behind us, and everyone has this inclination to get out and see everybody else and, you know, promote their cultures and things like that. I think there are problems with the Fermi paradox. I don't think it's quite as tight as some people use it.
Well, I'll say this, and I have two final thoughts. One, I thought the presence of video footage of the family capturing the meteorite was one pretty well done for 1994, and I thought it was a very modern thing. That's definitely what I'd be seeing that on like Fail Army.
Right.
But I think this movie ultimately, much like the unfortunate Plan 9 from Outer Space, is as much not maybe an anti-nuclear film, although that's certainly presented because it pits Russia, the newly formed Russia. Remember, this is only a couple years. We're in the height of the shock doctrine, which was a terrible thing, in my opinion. Russia, the United States, and China. And I think the story is more influenced by, like, we're not fully out of the Cold War. Like, the wall has fallen. The Soviet states, the Soviet blocs are starting to kind of reorganize themselves in their own, you know, they're no longer the union of nations that was the Soviet Union. It's definitely in very many ways influenced by the Cold War. And I think a lot of Americans may have been happy for a reunified Germany and happy that we kind of outlasted the Soviet Union. However, I can't imagine that many forward-thinking people didn't have some anxieties about what would come next.
No, I think you're right. And I think that like the point of this movie, kind of what they were getting at with what the one SETI astronomer was saying at the end, it's like, we did this. They showed up and we just started firing at them, which is, you know, in lots of alien movies. But I think that's always something that we could do more with hearing.